All right, for lesson 7, we are solving equations with square roots. Okay, we're solving equations with square roots. So let's go right to the examples here, and I will explain the steps through these examples. So our first example is the square root of x plus 4 equals 3. Our first step is to isolate the square root. In other words, get the square root by itself on one side of the equal sign. Well, in the case of number 1, the square root is already isolated. It is already by itself on one side of the equal sign. So I do not have to worry about step 1. All right, and then the rest is to square both sides. Why would I square both sides? Because squaring and square rooting are opposites of each other. So I would square both sides and then solve for x. So for number 1 here, I'm going to square both sides. Okay, because what will happen is on the left-hand side, the squared and the square root will cancel each other out, leaving me with x plus 4. And then on the right-hand side, I have 3 squared, which is 9. So I'm going to square both sides, and then I can now solve for x by simply subtracting 4 from both sides, and I end up with x equals 5. And that is it for number 1. Okay. Number 2, okay. Step 1 is to isolate the square root. So the square root is this part right here. Now that is not by itself, which means I need to get rid of this minus 4. In order to do that, I'm going to add 4 to both sides. Okay. If I do that, I end up with the square root of 3 minus x equals 0 plus 4. Okay, so now that I've isolated the square root, now I can go ahead and I can square both sides. Okay, all right, again, squaring and square rooting will cancel each other out, and that leaves me with 3 minus x, and 4 squared is 16. So 3 minus x equals 16. So I will subtract 3 from both sides. So negative x equals 13. And remember, in front of that x there's really an imaginary negative 1. That's really negative 1 times x. So there's really a negative 1 there. So I'm actually going to divide both sides by negative 1. So x is going to equal 13 divided by negative 1. So x is going to equal negative 13. All right. Number 3, I have to do some isolating again. So my square root is that. So in order to do that, in order to get that by itself, I have to get rid of the 2 here. So how am I going to get rid of the 2? I'm going to divide both sides by 2. Why? Because multiplying and dividing are opposites of each other. So I end up with the square root of x equals 20 divided by 2, which is 10. Now I can go ahead and square both sides to get rid of the square root. And I end up with x equals 10 squared, which is 100. Okay. Number 4, to isolate the square root, I have to get rid of the plus 9. So in order to do that, I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides. And I end up with the square root of 2x minus 3 equals 0 minus 9. And before I continue, I want to call your attention back to the lesson notes to this last part. Note, if you end up with the square root of something equals a negative number, the equation has no solution. Why does it have no solution? It goes back to what we talked about yesterday. Okay, it goes back to what we talked about yesterday. You cannot take the square root of a number and have the answer just be negative. You can't take the square root of something and have it just be negative. So in this particular case, we ended up with the square root of something equals a negative number, -9. Therefore, we can stop and safely say that this equation right here has no solution. So when you do your examples on your cool down tonight, be wary of that. If at any point in the process of solving you end up with the square root of something equals a negative number, like we did in number 4, that means your equation has no solutions. You can stop right there. That is it for lesson 7.